biography in your packet, but he currently serves as the Midwest Regional Director of the American Friends Service Committee, who we really love, as many of you know, and partner with. He has some words to share with us this morning about Zionism, which is a topic that we obviously encounter and deal with a lot. So we are happy to hear from him and have him with us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Marietta. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Excuse me while It's wonderful to be with you. I think the last time I was with you, what city was it? Detroit, that's right. That's right. I remember taking that little tram around and around and around in circles. But it was a fruitful visit, and I'm really honored to be working with you on this grand project, and it's always a pleasure to be with you. I'm sure that much of what you're talking about now, I think, as is the case for many of us, is the what now question. I think many denominations have passed divestment resolutions, many campuses, student groups have passed student-sponsored divestment resolutions, and so much of our energy and focus and resources has been directed toward these resolutions, and rightfully so. But then the question becomes, what comes after that? How do we capitalize on these victories? How do we see these wins as part of a longer strategic process? So if my conversation with you this morning could be in that spirit, rather than just a theoretical conversation, I'd be very, very grateful. So I was asked to speak about Zionism. I think about that subject a great deal. It's also, by the way, many of you may know that Jewish Voice for Peace, which is my primary Jewish institutional affiliation, is currently engaged in a process by which we are going to possibly, hopefully, come out with some kind of statement about Zionism, comprehensive statement on our stance on Zionism. Not simply to say whether we're Zionist or not, which I think is a simplistic way of looking at it, but unpacking more deeply what we consider Zionism to be, what we mean when we say Zionism, because it is a complex subject, and that word is often bandied about in ways that are less than helpful. There's a long history to the course of the Zionist thought and the Zionist movement, and so I'm not going to talk formally about that process, but I think many of the things that I have to offer, I'm really going to be speaking out of my own personal perspective and conviction. In hopes of having this conversation with you, I'm sure that you are processing this issue as well. And it's an important one. It's not just an academic issue. I think if we're going to build a movement of Palestinian solidarity that really is as inclusive as possible, as wide as possible, we need to clarify what we mean when we say Zionism, because there may well be Zionists who are part of this, or people who consider themselves Zionists, who are or have the potential to be part of this movement. And there are people like myself who, for most of their lives, consider themselves to be Zionists, who have moved along in this process as well. So this is not just a theoretical conversation. So I'll hold forth for about half an hour and then open it up. I'd love to hear your thoughts and responses. I'll begin by saying, as I took the L down this morning, I was listening to a podcast. It's one of my favorite podcasts. It's called Treif. Is anybody familiar with it? I highly recommend it. T-R-E-Y-F. Treif is a Yiddish word that means not kosher. And it is there. It's hosted by two young Canadian young men, Jewish, who live in Montreal and are, I would say, are Jewish radicals, and Zionism and anti-Semitism and Palestine and all of these things are part of their conversation and their mix. I was on their show once last year talking about Tzedek Chicago, my new congregation. And this morning they had on a man named Eli Valley. Is anybody familiar with him? He's a cartoonist, a really, you might have seen his stuff. He's a satirical cartoonist who has been getting himself in hot water because he goes right to the heart of some very incendiary issues in the Jewish community, particularly the American Jewish communal establishment. And he mentioned that he lived in Prague for 5 years, and during that time he was writing a book on, sort of a travel book on Prague and Budapest and other major cities in that region. And he spent a lot of time in the library, and he said, in addition to reading about the history of the region, he also found himself enthralled by reading the works of early 20th century Jewish intellectuals who were debating the tenor of their time and the central question of what it means to be Jewish in this rapidly changing world. And he said it was a rich and freewheeling conversation, and he said many of the periodicals I read were Zionist, and many of the people who were having these conversations were Zionists, but Zionism back then, and now this is me talking, Zionism back then was a much broader theoretical, intellectual enterprise, and it incorporated many different points of view. There were anarchist Zionists. There were Zionists who believed in cultural autonomy, if not territorial or political autonomy. Later on, when the Zionist movement began to become more prominent, there were Zionists like Judah Magnus and Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber who didn't believe in an exclusively Jewish sovereign political state in historic Palestine. So it was, when we talk about Zionism, we're talking about something that was historically very broad. And I will say for myself, when I identified myself as a Zionist, it was not primarily as a political Zionist. It was not the idea or the dream of a sovereign Jewish nation state in that land that I identified with. Although that was the current reality. I was, if you had asked me, 20, 30 years ago, who my intellectual mentors were, I'd say people like Achad Ha'am, who was an Eastern European Jewish thinker of that time that Eli Valley was talking about, he's known today as a cultural Zionist. He believed in he advocated for Jewish settlement in the land, but not in order to take political control over it, but rather to engage in a Jewish national cultural rebirth that would not do away with the diaspora, but that would center Jewish life and Jewish thought in this historic land that was so important to Jews for so many centuries, that could inspire the diaspora, which he felt was intellectually and spiritually running aground. And I identified in some ways, and still identify to certain parts of that cultural Zionist Renaissance thinking. However, it's not just theoretical anymore. It's not just academic anymore. Once the Jewish state was founded in 1949, Zionism became something else. At least this is in my perspective. That political Zionism was victorious. Political Zionism, Herzlian Zionism, the Zionism that was embodied in the Zionist movement that was founded by Theodor Herzl, that sought to create a Jewish nation state in historic Palestine because Jews needed a land of their own, not so much culturally, for cultural reasons, but for political reasons that, according to this point of view, that Jews were not safe in the diaspora, that Jews needed a homeland, a national political homeland of their own if they were going to survive, but also if their life would be normalized, that according to political Zionism, Jews were constantly otherized in the diaspora. They were constantly seen as other and did not live normal lives. only when they became a nation like all the nations. And that's drawing on biblical imagery of Kachol HaGoyim, when the people came to Samuel and said, give us a king, we want to be like all Kachol HaGoyim, all the other nations. This was seen as normalizing, that this would make us Jews normal people like everyone else in the world and not abnormal. And this was very much in keeping with the modern political ethos of the time, of political nationalism. To my mind, after 1949, all of the other forms of Zionism they're important historically, they're important intellectually, they may be even very much a part of Jewish identity in many different ways for Jews around the world. But from my point of view, and I will debate this and have debated this endlessly, when we talk about Zionism today, we're talking about the Zionism that's embodied by the State of Israel. And I think we need to be very, very clear about that. But at the same time, we need to recognize that historically, Zionism was something much broader, and we need to be careful when we conflate all of Zionism and the history of Zionism to this one militarized ethnic Jewish nation state. I think too easily we bandy about the word Zionist, and it takes on this sort of evil context that, well, Zionism was this, Zionism is this, and the reality is more complicated than that. So I try to be careful the way I use that term because of this. I have no trouble saying that Zionism is embodied by the State of Israel today. But when talking about what Zionism has wrought and what Zionism has been over the centuries, I think it's important to bear that in mind, that Zionism has always been a very rich and diverse and multifaceted ideology. So the other thing I want to say about Zionism that I think is important when we talk about it is, and this goes to what I was saying about sort of focusing on Zionism as this sort of exceptional, horrible, evil force in the Middle East, is that I and many in JVP, and this is part of the conversation I think we're having in JVP, is I understand Zionism in a colonial context. That it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not something unique or exceptional in the world. I would argue that Israel is a colonial settler state, a state that was founded through colonization from the outside, from Europe, that brought people from Europe physically over to settle the land, to colonize it and settle it, and take political power over it, and to rule over it. There are different kinds of settler colonial states throughout history. We happen to live in one ourselves. And I think it's very important to me when we talk about Zionism that we talk about it within that larger context. And I think it's very, not just for me, I think many of people who are joining organizations like JVP, particularly the younger generation who I think have a strong, many of these activists have a very strong rooting in understanding the world in a colonial, anti-colonial framework. It's very important that we see Zionism within this larger umbrella because this is intersectional work. There are people who are being colonized all over the world, the way Palestinians are, and there are people in our own backyard that are being colonized. And so I want to take this opportunity to say that we are having this meeting on ground that was colonized, that was originally settled by the Potawatomi and Chicago and other native peoples who were driven from this land, many cases expelled, physically forced into reservations, much the way Palestinians are being physically forced into areas in historic Palestine. And whenever we gather to talk about this issue, and I feel like whenever we gather, period, to engage in any kind of gathering of conscience, I want to honor the past, present, and future elders and leaders and people of these peoples whom we have driven from this land and who still exist on this land. We need to understand that our work in solidarity with the Palestinians is absolutely inseparable from the solidarity that we saw at Standing Rock and that we see in this country and all around the world with the plight of indigenous peoples. So right now, that is part of the discussion that's going on, is what is the context in which we understand what Zionism is today? What has it been leading up to this time? And how do we see our work practically going forward? And I would say that when I refer to intersectional work, I think that's part of the key of to the question of where do we go from here. I think the younger generations in particular are seeing their activism around Israel Palestine as being absolutely inseparable from forms of state violence all over, protesting state violence all over the world, whether it's in Ferguson or the south side of Chicago or Standing Rock or Myanmar or wherever it may be. That is, in fact, the only way, I believe, the only way we're going to truly build a mass movement to address the issues in Palestine. We can't see the issues of Palestine in a vacuum. And I'm hoping that our gatherings such as this, and gatherings, if any of you were at the national members meeting here in Chicago last year for Jewish Voice for Peace, you'll notice that many of the workshops and many of the presentations were not only about Palestinians, but also included folks from Black Lives Matter and indigenous folks from around the world, including this country. Our keynote speakers were not merely Jewish and Palestinian. And that is the direction, I believe, JVP, and I believe the future of the Solidarity movement is going. And I think it's important for us to grapple with. I think there is something of a generational divide here. And at the national members meeting, I heard from some of the older folk, I'm probably wedged somewhere in the middle. I can relate to both, to both sides of this, that a lot of the rhetoric, the anti-colonial rhetoric and the anti-racist rhetoric felt very jingoistic and felt very, well, when people talked about Zionism as racism, Zionism as colonialism, Zionism as genocide, that they felt it lacked an understanding of historically what Zionism had been. And also they felt that not all, but many of the older generations who have been doing this work for a long time felt that it was putting a focus exclusively on Israel when it needed to be seen in a more nuanced, if you will, a nuanced context. I understand that. I mean, for my part, I see myself perhaps as a bridge between these two ways of thinking. I do think that the issue of Israel-Palestine deserves a special focus for several reasons. One is because it's the largest recipient of military aid from our country, and as Americans, that makes us complicit in a very real way. As a Jew, this is a state that is acting in my name, and so I feel a special responsibility because of the complicity that is being projected onto me to stand with Palestinians. And I would say that the land is a place that is deeply and centrally important to not only Jews, but to Christians and to Muslims, and that all who are invested in the well-being of that place have a special responsibility. So I make no bones about that. I mean, the majority of my own actions of conscience and involvement in movements of liberation are focused through Israel-Palestine and grappling with what is the legacy of Zionism. However, at the same time, I can't lose sight of the fact that, as I said before, this is not something that exists in a vacuum. It couldn't. Israel could not have come to be if not for the support of the colonial powers of its day. Israel relied upon Great Britain for its support from the Balfour Declaration all the way down. The Balfour Declaration was a declaration that was promising a Jewish homeland from an empire that was colonizing the world, that didn't even have, it was still land that was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time it was being promised to the Jewish people, or to the Zionist movement rather. And then later through the United States, another colonial power. The Zionist movement wasn't colonialism in the classic sense of empire colonialism, but it very much relied upon empire colonialism to exist. It could not exist if it was not for the colonial enterprise, and I think that's very important. And if we do believe that, then we need to stand no less firmly with the colonized peoples of the world, not only the Palestinians. I think that's Puerto Ricans, absolutely. And if we don't, then shame on us. So I think there's a ethical, historical reason to do that, and I think there's a practical reason to do that, because you can't build a movement on a single issue. It needs to find common cause. It needs solidarity. If it's going to be a broad-based global movement, it needs to involve everyone who, one way or another, is impacted by these oppressive forces. So these are some of the things I've been thinking about when I think about the issue of Zionism. I think it's very, very important that while we are protesting the human rights abuse that is going on daily, that is going on at this moment in Palestine, it can't be at the expense of the human rights violations that are happening in our own country, in our own cities, in our own backyard, and places that our country impacts in negative ways, in deeply negative ways all around the world. So I'll end there because I'm starting to hear my voice bouncing around in my head. And I know I touched on, in a very short amount of time, I touched on a lot of issues, both historical and current and theoretical and practical. So I'm happy to talk about anything that you are interested in talking about, whether it's something I talked about or it's something I didn't talk about, but is roughly related to the subject matter. So yes, sir.
Yes, Brant, thank you for this. And there's kind of a living example of what you're talking about. In our own IPMN blog network, in which you have a regular blog. And your current one is on your recent trip to Gaza, which you spoke about to some of us in LA last week. Mm-hmm. Would you care to say a little bit about that, or at least I want to lift up the fact that we should read that, because I think this gives us a living example of what it means to be doing what you're saying.
So I visited Gaza briefly 2 weeks ago as a staff person with the American Friends Service Committee. We have programs all over the world, not only in this country, and we have programs in Palestine, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in 48 Israel, and in Gaza. And AFSC, as many of you I'm sure know, has been in Gaza since 1949. They were asked by the UN to to go in and provide relief for the refugees there. And after a little over a year, when it became clear to AFSC that the UN had no intention of resolving or repatriating the refugees, they came to them and said, we're not going to do this ad infinitum, short of some kind of political resolution. And so that's when UNRWA, the UN organization that exists to this day that basically governs the life of Palestinian refugees, was created. But AFSC has always had a presence in Gaza since that time. And their work today has to do with Palestinian youth and supporting the lives of Palestinian youth. In the era of the blockade, it has a unique, there's unique work to do. because youth in Gaza are utterly cut off from the world, certainly, but also from their peers, from other Palestinian young people. And fragmentation of Palestinian society is a huge, huge issue. Going back to colonial tactics, divide and conquer is a time-honored tactic, and I'm sorry to say it's really working in the case of Palestinians. They are cut off from one another. I think the crisis in leadership that we're seeing, and just the crisis in general that's facing Palestinians, much of it has to do with the fact that they're being very strategically separated from not only from Israel, but from one another. So the program that AFSC is doing in Gaza is, it's not youth empowerment so much as it's really, some of you may be familiar with the terms, or the rhetorical terms coexistence versus co-resistance, that we're moving from a coexistence paradigm, which is let's all have dialogue and see what we have in common and see how we can get along, which is wonderful in an equitable context, to co-resistance, which understands the imbalanced oppressive context and doesn't seek only to empower Palestinian youth, but to connect them with one another, to empower them to resist the oppression, and find ways that those in solidarity can partner with them as well. So that's the program in Gaza that we're doing, and we were there we were there for work. We were there to have meetings, like you're having, with the staff in West Bank and then in Gaza. And it was my first time in Gaza for a very, very long time. The last time I was there was a radically different reality. I was there when I was in my 20s and in the early 80s, and I was in Tel Aviv with some friends and said, let's just go down to Gaza for the day and go to the beach. It was a time when it was under Israeli military occupation, and it was a very simple matter to go down there and sort of blithely be unaware, or to be consciously unaware of the oppression that surrounded us. But now it's not that easy, as you know. Getting permission to go to Gaza, getting into Gaza, and then being in Gaza and experiencing just the stifling reality of what Palestinians there are experiencing day to day, particularly young people, because young people are now reaching the age where they don't know much about what came before the blockade. They know some, but for them, blockaded Gaza is the only Gaza they really know. And so that there's much that comes with that, not least of which is that they don't really see Israelis, they don't really see Jews. One young person said to me, when they left Gaza to participate in a AFSC program in Ramallah, when they went through the Erez crossing in the north and they saw Israeli soldiers for the first time, it was the first time they'd ever seen an Israeli. He said before that, Israelis were just gunships and Apache helicopters and drones, and which is fascinating, because when we talk to the West Bank youth, it was the exact opposite. The soldiers were an absolute, constant, ubiquitous presence in their lives all the time. So that little piece gives you just a snapshot of the radical difference in experience of Palestinians with just kilometers away from one another. There's much I can say. I did write about some of my experiences on the blog, and I'm going to write more. I've been doing so much traveling since then that I haven't really had time to emotionally process it all. But the only other thing I'll say is that I met some amazing, wonderful people there, and at the same time, I don't want to romanticize Palestinians in Gaza, or anywhere for that matter. There's this concept of sumud that I know you're familiar with, of Palestinian steadfastness, and the form of resistance that just means living day to day, getting through the day, maintaining some semblance of dignity in an inordinately undignified circumstances is a form of resistance, and I think that's true. But the more we laud Palestinians for their sumud, there's a kind of a normalization going in there too. They shouldn't have to be so resilient. It's easy to romanticize their resilience. I think we should honor it, but also spend as much time, if not more, in addressing the issues that are forcing them to be so resilient. Otherwise, we're just sort of tokenizing them, I think. And I went away from Gaza feeling that more than ever. Every time I wanted to write about these amazing people who were incredibly steadfast and very dignified, visionary, smart, promising young people, I hesitate to say all those things at the same time because there's nothing normal about what they're forced to live in, and we need to remind ourselves of that constantly. Yes?
I'd like to invite your comments on the theme, What Now, that you mentioned at the beginning. And to do that, I just bring up an article that one of our leaders, Nushin, mentioned yesterday that she plans to put in a new book.
Is Nushin here?
And now what?
Okay.
A realistic approach to the current impasse by Jonathan Kuttab. Now, I agree with most of what he says here, but the question still is, how do we accomplish this? It seems like almost everything he's listed here is something the government of Israel has to do. For example, end the administrative detentions and releasing administrative detainees, remove all the the restrictions, the blockades within the West Bank, eliminate the siege of Gaza, allow people to move from Gaza to the West Bank. I mean, we don't...
Well, those are goals, but they're not strategies.
I mean, how do we... Well, in terms of what now, it seems to be, as you say, inadequate. But how do we get a lever on these things? Is this even valid to say?
Well, it's valid. These goals are nothing new. I mean, these have been our goals for a very long time. The question is, what is our strategy toward achieving these goals? Well, I would love to hear your thoughts. You've been having these meetings and you've been talking about these. Anybody, before I hold forth, is there anyone here who has thoughts about this? Or how is IPMN characterizing what the next step of the strategy should be? Pauline?
I don't know how that's all working out as an organization, but I think it's pretty clear we need to lobby Congress, we need to work with our elected officials, we need to insist on certain realities, and that's building that mass movement that you were describing and how we do that. So it's multifaceted. You can't just do one thing.
Right.
You've got to try and do it all. It's
Right.
overwhelming and very discouraging.
Well, so to that I would say, well, I'll solicit lots of answers to that question, and then I had some thoughts. Yeah.
I agree that it's multifaceted, but as in this network, I'm intrigued by the idea of, I think there's nothing like going and seeing. And I think the most important segment of people in our church to go and see are pastors. And I think the most important pastors to go and see are young pastors. So I think if we could foster young, fresh out of seminary, Presbyterian pastors to go and see, I just think that would have a tremendous impact.
Great. Is there a hand over here I saw? Yeah, Don?
I think it's a time where we really need to reflect on our theology and what our core is and critique some of the different threats that are blocking us working for justice.
I think too that I want to touch on the word you used, co-resistance. Because that has to be a strategy with a well-organized set of tactics. I remember hearing Ilan Pape making the statement that Palestinians now need to take back the initiative. Because we can do advocacy here, which is necessary, we can do campaigning, etc., etc., etc. But unless the Palestinians themselves take back the initiative to say, okay, to the colonial settlers, we know you are here, we know that you are not going to be sent back to where you came from, but you came and have become part of our living. Let's find a way that we can live together and resist the oppression that you yourselves participate in. And by taking a stronger initiative with all the solidarity that they can get from movements here, rather than tokenism or paternalism or whatever ism there can be, working together with them. I see a good example in Sam Bahor, who has himself taken some initiative back and writing in the Jerusalem Post. That's the kind of thing that is needed now in answer to the question of what now.
So I just want to announce there are others, I call you, but just for what has been shared now, and I want to start with what you're saying, and I don't want to sound defeatist, but I think we need to be realistic about the challenges that are before us. One thing that's becoming increasingly clear to me is, going back to the divide and conquer strategy, that I think we need to admit that it's working. It's working really, really well. And it's working to the extent that when we say things like the Palestinians need to XYZ, what Palestinians are we talking about? If you talk to Palestinians anywhere in the world, or even in the land itself, or even in just the West Bank, you are going to get lots of different points of view about what needs to happen. You'll hear a lot of disagreement. I saw Sam when I was in Ramallah 2 weeks ago. I'm a huge admirer of his. But if you talk to him for any length of time, he has strong opinions. And there are Palestinian leaders that he would say, I'm not sure that's the right way to go. Omar Barghouti, who is the head of the BNC, the Boycott National Committee, who is very much an important Palestinian leader, he is by no means a consensus leader for Palestinians either. There are people who disagree with not necessarily the writ large the tactics, the concept of BDS, but the way that it's being organized. And so I think part of the challenge, and I'm not sure I have an answer to it, to be honest, is the Palestinians are a fragmented people, and they're fragmented for a reason, because they're being fragmented. And the central rule of solidarity is you take your lead from the people who are most directly impacted by the oppression. The challenge or the problem is that we want to take our lead from them, but there's no strong consensus. There's no strong leader who, back in the days of the PLO, it was different. There was a party that could reasonably represent a wide variety of Palestinians, where we don't have that today. We have a lot of internal division and disagreement. So I want to lay that out there, because I don't want to be Pollyannish about our prospects. I don't think it looks good, to be honest. I don't say that because that means we need to stop our efforts, but I think we need to be realistic about the challenges that are before us. I think everything we heard here is absolutely right. I agree with everything that's been said. I think there are many different tools in our toolkit that we need to be using, whether it's legislative work, whether it's bringing the right people, identifying the right people to bring over there to bear witness to what's going on, whether it's the theological work we're doing. I mean, each of us has a part to play. These are all. No one strategy is going to succeed, but a multi-faceted approach is the one that's going to need to happen. And I think each of us as individuals need to think about, well, where do I need to be? What am I called, to use a good Christian term? Well, where am I called to? What is the work I'm called to do? And as IPMN, what, according to our mission, the mission of our organization, what are we together being called to do? I think that's all we can be doing right now, while being realistic about the current context and addressing it in an effective way. So there were more hands. You had your hand up before. Yeah.
Yes. I'm just going to remind you of our call last night that we talked about the advocacy plan. I'm kind of like the curator of advocacy for IPMN now, and so our plan is that we're both going to maintain the work that we've done on our denominational level at our General Assembly, help to educate our denomination, help to educate other denominations that want to do similar work. But also, so we want to educate. We want to protect the work that we've done on our generational level. But we also want to learn from other communities. Maybe there isn't one Palestinian leader that we can look to, but there are leaders in the Black community, there are leaders in the Native community that we can learn from, that we want to connect with. And so my call to them last night was to find a young person, a person of color, or a Palestinian that we can invite into our space to teach us, not just to mentor. Maybe we have something to teach them, but to teach us as an organization how we can strategize for the future. So we're both protecting our work and recognizing that our work, we have a lot to learn about where to go from here.
That's great. Thank you. Yes.
You packed a lot in on the nuances of Zionism. And we've all had to learn the nuances of talking about the policies of the state of Israel rather than talking about any Jewish identity, because one, you could be accused of anti-Semitism if you focus on the policies of the state, then you're criticizing the state. So I really need to get, in a succinct way, the nuances of Zionism. So I just wanted to see if this one sentence captures it. What I have is the militarized form of Zionism that is embodied by the state of Israel today. Does that narrow it sufficiently for you to honor all the other historic, forms of Zionism that build up to that?
I appreciate the spirit in which you're wrestling with this, but I would say that's a little bit too narrow. Because it's more than just militarization. I think that's the problem. It's not just the militarized nature of the state. It's, there's also a very complex and sophisticated legal system that's been set up that is just as effective at dislocating Palestinians from their homes as the army is. I mean, they're all interlinked, but it's not simply militarization. I wouldn't say it's simply militarization. I would say that, going back to what I was saying before, I know the issue is fraught because Israel fancies itself the Jewish nation. So when you're criticizing Israel, you're somehow criticizing Jews everywhere. However, just criticizing the policies to me, is not enough, because I don't think the problem is policy-based. I think it's more deeply rooted than that. The way I sometimes like to put it is, when I was a liberal Zionist, I saw the problem as 1967, but now I realize that the problem is 1948. And so that the problem isn't just simply the occupation, which is usually assumed to be the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, but the problem is the very concept of an ethnic Jewish nation state in historic Palestine. So I would say that the Zionism that we're talking about is Jewish ethnic nation statism. I mean, that's how I would put it. And because, ethnic nationalism is sort of a term, it's sort of a piece of rhetoric, but what it means, as opposed to, say, civic nationalism, where people are bound together through their identity with the nation itself, with the civic nation. So in America, for all of, we are a settler colonial enterprise, certainly, but it's not controversial to be a Jewish American or a Christian American or a Muslim American or a Hindu American or a secular American or a Zoroastrian American or even a Native American. That those are not, no one disputes any of that. There may be people, like particularly who are on the ascent today, who are trying to define American in much narrower terms. But I think we're on safer ground when we argue the common connection of all Americans. That's civic nationalism. France is, I think, civic nationalism like on steroids in some ways. They want to hold on so much to the French identity, sometimes at the expense of the religious identity, some would argue. In Israel is not the only ethnic nation state, by the way, but Eastern Europe is full of them. In Israel, because Judaism has been, which has historically been a religious identity, has been wrenched around to become a national identity, if you're not Jewish, you're not part of the civic collective. And there is actually, I'm sure many of you know this, there's a difference between being a citizen and a national in Israel proper. It's on your ID card. If you're a citizen of Israel, no matter what religion you are, you have citizen stamped on your ID card. If you are not Jewish, if you're Jewish, you're also a national because it's a Jewish nation, right? But if you're not Jewish, you're not a national. You're a citizen, but you're not a national. And Ezrachi and Leumi is the Hebrew terms. And there are very important rights-based differences between being a citizen and being a national. So automatically you are creating divisions between people who are ostensibly all citizens of the same country. And that's the problem with Zionism, in my opinion, that if you're creating a Jewish state in a land that has been historically an exclusively Jewish state, in a land that has been historically multi-religious, then you're automatically otherizing everyone there who's not Jewish, whether they're Muslim or Christian. Does that answer your question?
Call themselves a democracy.
Well, we call ourselves a democracy too, by the way. I read recently that I can't remember what was the think tank that recently determined that the United States is not a democracy. We're an oligarchy. I don't remember. Yeah. But,
Princeton.
Yeah, lots of democracy. Princeton. Lots of democracies love to call themselves democracies. That's pretty common. Yes.
Getting back to the subject of strategizing, which we started talking about, the implicit question was, what can we do at the present time that would help us, that would give us the hope we might accomplish something? And at the present moment, as I alluded to yesterday, I think the American Civil Liberties lawsuit in Kansas, affirming the right of a Mennonite Christian woman, Esther Kuntz, who is being barred from employment by the state of Kansas.
Well, I think it's barred from a training program. Yeah,
well,
but participating as a right. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Just trying to use shorthand.
Yeah.
Simply because she will not sign a statement saying that she won't boycott Israel, or by implication, Israel and territories it controls. So there have been several op-eds in newspapers in Kansas and elsewhere, making, explicating on what's going on with this lawsuit and how it's a threat to our First Amendment rights, freedom of speech rights, and letters to the editor can be written as well. And by the way, we need to remember that even if our letter to the editor is not published, the newspaper, the editorial board, will take note and keep account of letters on particular issues. So in that sense, they're keeping track of what your positions are as a reader of their newspapers. So this is something I think we can have some hopes of actually having some influence at the present time.
There is a full-page article.
Sometimes, and short-term and not big.
Right.
And long.
I believe there is a full-page article that's going to run in the Kansas City Star. That's, some of you may be involved in the organizing of that. I know the JVP Rabbinical Council recently signed on to it, and they're still.
We're signing on.
Yeah, and they still need money. And just to piggyback on that, it's sort of a two-sided coin, because we're seeing now the the blowback or the reaction to BDS, and it's fierce. And part of the response has been this legislation, national and state-based legislation. And on the one hand, I think there's a part of me that feels that we're sort of, our energies are being diverted because we're so busy playing defense against this legislation. That, could someone give me a, I'm getting dry. Thank you. We're so busy playing defense against this legislation that it's keeping us from the charge, from the mission. On the other hand, I think there is an opportunity in this, and that's not, and it's important strategically, I think, that beating down this legislation is not an end in itself, as you're saying. It's short term. But it can have a very important secondary effect of educating the world, the states and the nation and the world about what BDS actually is. So we should see this as an opportunity not just to play defense, but to raise awareness on what BDS is and what it isn't. And if it brings thank you so much. If it brings you a mainstream liberal organization like the ACLU on your side, that's a good thing as well. So I think it's just always important to keep the big picture in perspective. Is there someone who hasn't spoken yet? Yes. Oh, you did speak, Pauline. What? Okay, go ahead.
I want to get back to your JBT discussion.
Uh-huh.
I'm really interested in how the discussion is going about cultural Zionism and where you're going with that, and especially since we have a mutual friend I've asked, if it's not the state of Israel as a Jewish state, what do you do with your Zionism belongings? And her response was that she thinks it's possible for there to be the idea of a homeland to be there without it being a political state. Mm-hmm. And that it can be a place where Jews still see themselves as coming home, but it doesn't have to be exclusive. And I wondered if that's the direction you're going, because I think it's important to the BDS discussion that we understand this.
Yeah. I think it's too early to say what specific direction we're going, but what you're talking about is definitely a huge part of the conversation. I can tell you my point of view of sort of the implications of that conversation. And this gets into some of the things that Don was saying about the theology, too. From a political point of view, I think our goal needs to be everybody who lives in that land or wants to live in that land, no matter what their religion is, should have equal rights. That's the goal. We can work out the issues of cultural and national autonomy within that place, but the ultimate goal is that everybody needs to be equal under the law. If you want to call yourself a cultural Zionist in that context, knock yourself out. That's that's an intellectual academic issue, and in many ways a personal way of understanding the world. But I think what that means is any form of Zionism that stands in the way of equal rights for all needs to be fought. Any form of Zionism that allows for equal rights for all should be welcomed. To me, that's the baseline, that's the barometer, that's the litmus test. To the issue of homeland, that's a really complex and important issue. And I've been doing a lot of increasingly writing about this from a theological point of view, and that is that I've become a diasporist, and in as much as I believe that what has made Judaism special, what has been the heart of Judaism has been its understanding that after the destruction of the temple, that God was not simply this geographically specific deity, but God, it was a radical re-theologizing of what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be human, is that the rabbis said, no, God is everywhere. God is in exile with us wherever we are in exile. The concept of diaspora and of being home that there's two concepts of home. Maybe home is where you hang your hat, but also home is the place that you're yearning for, and that's universal. We all can relate to that, right? We're all, there's a part of us that's yearning for home. The minute we're born, we're yearning for home, and we never fully get there. But in the meantime, we make home with one another, wherever we happen to live in the world. And I think that's Judaism. Judaism, for thousands of years, really sanctified. I mean, I can point you to countless statements in the Talmud and by the rabbis that wherever people study Torah together, the Shekhinah abides, that God, wherever you establish a community, God is with you. It takes the Mishkan, the tabernacle, as a prototype for God. Mishkan has the root of Shekhinah, which means the indwelling presence, so that God indwells with you wherever your journey takes you. And by the way, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, almost all of it takes place. Most of it takes place outside the land of Israel, and none of it takes place in the kingdom of Israel. That happens after Deuteronomy. So I would argue that, from a diasporist point of view, that Israel is the concept of Israel is powerful on a spiritual, aspirational level, as it always has been. From a traditional point of view, it's embodied by the Messiah. But even if you don't literally believe in the coming of an actual Messiah, you can understand Messianic days to be the aspirational world that we're all striving for and fighting for and together trying to create, which is how I prefer to see Messianism, because I think literal Messianism, and I would include ultra-Orthodox Jews in this, even the ones who are non-Zionist, I think is a dark road to go down. But I wouldn't throw away Messianism completely. I would just understand it in, as I said, in more symbolic aspirational terms for the direction toward which we're striving. So I see homeland in that. That's fine. If you want to pick up and live there to express your yearning for homeland, that's great. But the minute you start to conflate homeland and national home, in this day and age, national meaning political national, then I think we're starting to go down. I think we're seeing the results of where that's led us. I should also add that for centuries, making pilgrimage to the land of Israel was considered a mitzvah, was considered a commandment. And living in Israel was certainly something that the most pious would do, and it was certainly encouraged. But it didn't mean that you could not find God where you lived, and it certainly didn't mean that you should go there and create your own state. That never meant that until Zionism came along. Yes. You're next. Yes. No, that's okay. I'm losing track, but yeah, go ahead.
You talked about the fragmentation in the Palestinian.
We can't hear you.
Stand up and speak up.
Sorry. You discussed the fragmentation in the Palestinian leadership. In Ann Arbor, we have been concerned about the fragmentation in the Palestinian
Solidarity leadership, yeah. So tell me, could you say more about what that fragmentation looks like?
Well, we've had, we have had lots of contact with JVP. We've experienced Anna Balcher in our community at various times, Allison Weir, and we've had a hard time understanding what happened.
The Allison Weir,
And
If
why-
Americans Knew issue?
and, yeah, I mean, we've heard different things, and none of them are very nice.
So I could, I don't want to get too far into that rabbit hole.
And I know it is one, and I hesitated.
Yeah,
to
no,
bring it
that's
up, but
okay.
It's something that we talk about.
Yeah,
in
and
the
I could,
homeland.
and so I'll just say from my point of view, and I'll focus on one aspect of it that I find to be very important. Two aspects. So I was speaking once, right after I wrote my book. I was going on a book reading tour, and I was speaking at a bookstore in Baltimore called Red Emma's, which is a sort of a leftist anarchist bookstore with really disciplined, politically thinking folks. And it's a great bookstore, and they have my book there, so I recommend it. And I said, in passing, I said, there are so many things that our government is supporting that are not in our national self-interest. I just sort of said that. This kind of came out of my mouth. And someone said, you know, I don't think they're in the world's self-interest. And that really, this sort of goes back to what I was saying about understanding Zionism within a colonial context, that, well, yeah, I'm not interested in promoting America's national self-interest. That those words are synonymous with militarism and domination, in my opinion. And I think part of the problem of, part of what disturbs me about Alison Weir and those who are in her camp is that they do tend to see Israel in a vacuum. And that they, when you say if Americans knew, they would not be supporting this. Well, lots of Americans know, and lots of Americans support this. That the problem isn't that it's not in America's self-interest. I think we need to have a broader view, and if we're progressive only on Palestine and not on these other issues, if we're talking about this issue exclusively about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, you know, I think that is, whether or not it's anti-Semitic, I think it's flirting dangerously with anti-Semitism because it's singling Israel out for criticism that we're not willing to direct toward ourselves, even, or other colonial powers around the world. So that's one thing. Have you heard of the acronym PEP, Progressive Except for Palestine? Well, I've heard that there's also POOP, a progressive only on Palestine. And I think that, you know, I don't mean to be facetious, Rabbi did not, but I think that goes back to what I was saying before about really taking a broad view. And I think if Americans knew, I think, is so focused on how America was sort of bamboozled into becoming Zionist, and that if we didn't allow ourselves to be manipulated by Zionism and by Israel, that we would do differently, I think is that's not my analysis, and I think it points us down a disturbing road. The other thing I would say is Alison Weir's willingness to appear on radio programs of white supremacists, I find to be deeply disturbing. Particularly in this day and age, I think now we can understand the importance of not giving any quarter to these views. I'm not a free speech hawk. I think there are certain kinds of speech that we need to fight against and giving airtime to. And I think her explanation of I'll talk with anyone anywhere if they'll give me a platform, I think is, and I don't think I'm misrepresenting her point of view, I find very troubling. And I think in the age of the alt-right ascendancy, I think we need to be very, very careful about who we're lending credence to. Even if we're appearing on a show where we might not agree with the views of the person, we are legitimizing them by agreeing to be on that show. And her repeated insistence and refusal to stop doing that, I just don't understand, and I find troubling. So those are just two pieces of the Alison Weir situation that I'm just speaking for myself. And I know it was gut-wrenching to, when JVP and the US campaign cut off relations with them, but if we're going to be a principled solidarity movement, and we're going to believe that solidarity means it's all of us or none, then I think we need to be principled and disciplined about that, no matter how painful it might be. So, yes. Hi.
Appropriate, Matt. It's about the same thing you've been talking about. Your title today is Zionist. what would be the title if you were addressing the driving force, the ideology of the U.S. colonial settler state? It's easy for us to direct our attention as a network in the global mission department of our denomination to that which is over there. But we have not found a way, I don't think, to even name the driving ideology of the U.S. settler state. It's coming out now in white privilege and in white supremacy and so forth. But we couldn't use a word like Americanism to replace Zionism, to direct our attention to our own theology, to our own driving ideology. And how can, I'm saying, can you help us focus on that? I would like to see us not just deal with the Congress on policy decisions which are driven by this ideology, but to help our churches deal with the ideology that's driving the empire. How do we name it?
Well, actually, that last word you just mentioned was the one I was going to suggest, is empire. But exceptionalism, you know, there's no one perfect word. You know, I think different words come into currency. I think white supremacy right now is becoming, I think people are opening their eyes to, especially lots of well-meaning white folk are opening their eyes to the reality of white supremacy. But that doesn't bring in, per se, the economic component, right? That capitalism is also a big part of it. So it's a multi-headed dragon, and I don't think we're going to find the one perfect word for it. I think empire is helpful, particularly when we're talking theologically, because I think the Roman Empire is such a metaphor. I think for Christians it's particularly powerful, I would think, that Jesus's relationship to empire as a resistor to empire and promoting a form of religious worldview that was in counter distinction to empire, I think could be helpful. You know, we live in an age of, let's face it, I mean, we often hear the United States referred to as the world's only superpower. And that's maybe not a classical empire in the classical sense of the word, but I think it's an empire. I think, you know, and there are lots of political scientists who have written about this. And so, you know, so that, I personally keep coming back to that, and maybe it's also, you know, the influence of Mark Ellis, you know, who I think has written very, very articulate pieces on empire and its impact on the world. So, I just want to say, well, that it's not, it's great, it's fine to have Israel Palestine be your focus. You know, you can't focus everywhere all at the same time. It's not going to work. So what I'm just suggesting is that through that focus, we're able to shed light on the broader context at the same time, that we never lose sight of the broader context. And if that, we call that context empire, you know, I think there are many young people who will call it white supremacy. There are young people in the DSA, you know, the Democratic Socialists of America, who will say, well, it's capitalism and white supremacy and racism, institutional racism is one of the tools that capitalists use to divide people and to gain power. And whatever your analysis is, and I just got back from, where was I last? Indiana, a talk in Indiana with Mennonites in Elkhart. And we talked about this, that there is this sort of raging debate now on the left in America, between those who see things in white supremacist terms and those who see things in capitalist terms. And I'm sure you're familiar with this debate. And, you know, the capitalists say, white supremacists are just identity politics, promoters, and on the other side they're saying that, you only see things in economic terms. We can hold all of them in front of us at the same time. Whatever your analysis, and this sort of goes back to what I was saying to Pauline, that call yourself whatever you want. Oppression is oppression. Use whatever words you want and frame it wherever you want, as long as you see that it's an interlocking system of the powerful against the vulnerable. And I hate to be so reductionist, but I think at the root, that's what we're talking about. And for me, I find myself talking a lot lately about, I know I'm going over, so maybe this might be the end, but my own movement from a conflict paradigm to an oppression analysis. That seeing these problems as problems of conflict. And conflict assumes, equal parties in conflict over some kind of common resource, whether it's, the land of Israel or water in, Standing Rock or what have you. I've moved to an oppression paradigm, which is that we don't have a level playing field. We have an inherently imbalanced playing field that is being used by the powerful and has been time immemorial to oppress the powerless for their own gain. And if that's the way we view the world, then it can be applied in many different ways. But it's, for me, at its essence, I don't think it's any more basic than that. So.